Hi, I'm Brian Watson, and this is another episode of God and Evil. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about theodicies, which is going to be a lot of what we talk about in this program. And I'm actually going to make a defense for generating theodicies. So, quick recap. Theodicies are basically stories of why God would allow or ordain evil. I'm a Christian, and I'm going to be talking more specifically about theodicies that involve the Christian conception of God. So, in other words, the story is not just why God would allow evil, but why the God of the Bible would allow evil to occur, especially since the God of the Bible is omnipotent. He has full range of powers. He is all-knowing. He's omniscient. And he's good, or the Bible even says he's love. So theodicies try to explain that God is right in allowing evil to occur, and they give a reason or reasons why that is so. Now, this is an important issue for people who believe in God. It's an important issue for people who are considering whether God exists or not, people who are, for example, hearing about the Jesus Christ and the truth claims that Christians make, and they're trying to consider whether these things are true, and then they think about evil. They want to have some understanding of why there's evil in the world. The problem of evil is important for people who are philosophically minded. It's certainly something that comes up a lot in the field of study known as philosophy of religion. I just got a PhD in philosophy of religion, and the problem of evil is a large topic in philosophy of religion. I wrote a dissertation about the problem of evil, and a lot of my dissertation is my own theodicy. So I think it's important. And yet I found in researching theodicies that there are people who are against the practice. They don't think we should come up with theodicies. I'll call them anti-theodicists. So a theodicist is a person who makes a theodicy, or at least supports the idea that there should be theodicies. They think that's a good thing. Anti-theodicists say, no, we shouldn't do that. And I found that there are a number of these people. Many of them are Christians. And the reason why they think that we shouldn't come up with theodicies is because they're misguided, they're impractical, they're unhelpful, they can condone evil, they can generate passivity in the face of evil, they can even add more evil to the world, they can cause more suffering. And that, at least for the Christian anti-theodicists, they're not sufficiently Christian. So I think it's important to hear out what these people have to say, because just generally it's good to consider the objections, the criticisms that people have, to understand them on their own terms, and then to consider whether there's any truth in those criticisms. So here are their objections. So one is that evil is, in their view, something that is ultimately irrational, mysterious, incomprehensible. So, for example, Lars Svensson, who's a Norwegian philosopher, he's an atheist, he says that to explain evil, the complete explanation of evil would be an act of intellectual hubris. Kenneth Surin, a Christian theologian, says evil and suffering are fundamentally mysterious. They confound the human mind. So, how could we even begin to explain such things? Now, that's a futile exercise in the eyes of these people, but they think it's not just futile, it's also something that it's not helpful, because it's an academic exercise. It's an intellectual exercise. It's something that is very theoretical. It's something for the ivory tower. It's not something that would help the average person. When people are dealing with suffering, when people are hurting, they don't need an explanation of why there's evil in the world. They just need help. Now, these theodicists, or anti-theodicists, I should say, they think instead of trying to come up with these grand theories, it would be better to focus our time and attention on preventing evil, if we can do that, on eliminating evil or fighting against evil or lessening the amount of evil in the world. So when someone's hurting, they don't need a lecture on theodicy. If someone has a disease or they got into an accident and their body's hurting, they don't need to be told why there's evil in the world. They just need help right now. Here's another criticism from those anti-theodicists. Not only is it the case that evil is mysterious and incomprehensible and irrational, and we just can never really get to the bottom of it, not only is the case that explaining evil isn't really helpful and practical, but they think it's actually possible that theodicies can condone evil or create passivity in the face of evil. And the idea here is something like this. Okay, most theodicies that are presented by Christians will say that God is a good reason for allowing evil to occur, and that evil is either something of like an unintended byproduct of something that's good. So evil is made possible by some good, or some great good actually requires there being evil. So for the first case, the free will theodicy, some variation of the free will theodicy, is basically some good that makes evil possible. So on that idea, God gives us libertarian free will. We can do this, we can do that. It's up to us. God can't determine that we use our free will to do this or that, to do good or evil. But supposedly that kind of freedom is necessary for love, it's necessary for faith in God, it's necessary for moral responsibility. So it opens up the door to evil. But if God were to remove evil, the only way he could do it would be to tamper with our wills, and then he'd lose those other goods. That's the basic idea. Other theodicies will say some great goods actually need there to be evil. So in order to be brave, to be courageous, to be compassionate, to help those who are hurting, to sacrifice, to achieve great victory over evil, you actually need evil first. For God to demonstrate his full range of attributes, all his great-making properties to the greatest extent, there needs to be evil, something like that. And so the idea there is that actually evil serves a good purpose. It's not good in and of itself, but it's instrumentally good. So the anti-theodists, they say, okay, well, maybe we should just be passive when evil occurs and not fight against it, because maybe we're fighting against God's will by fighting against evil. We're justifying evil. We're making light of evil. And we shouldn't do that. We should just fight against evil. That's the idea. Now, some of their objections go further, and they say not only is it the case that theodicies condone evil, they actually are evil, or they add to people's suffering. And the idea here is that some evil happens, and then some armchair theodicist comes along and says, aha, I know why this evil is occurring. It's because you've done this bad thing. Famous example is in the book of Job, in the Old Testament of the Bible. So Job is a righteous man, we're told, and yet he suffers greatly. He loses all his material possessions. His 10 children die. His health is greatly affected. He's like on death's door. And all this is happening for reasons that he doesn't know and his friends don't know. The story is quite fascinating because it's happening due to a conversation that God and Satan are having in heaven. But Job's friends come, and at first they come to comfort him in this time of suffering, but then they start to speculate, and they think, Job, you must have done something totally wrong, some grievous sin, in order for you to be experiencing all these awful things. And sometimes there are people who will do such a thing. So, for example, Hurricane Katrina occurred in 2005, it's over 20 years ago now. And it devastated New Orleans and other places along the Gulf Coast. And there were some people who would say things like, oh, Hurricane Katrina happened because the people in New Orleans are so sinful because of, the partying and the licentiousness and voodoo and whatever. And something similar would happen, for 9/11. There are people who would say, well, America deserved that because America has turned its back on God, or New York deserved that because, New York is so full of sin, or something like that. And so what people are doing in speculating is not only are they being arrogant and proud and saying far beyond anything that they could ever know, but they're actually making people who are suffering just feel worse. So there's one more objection. And one final one I'll consider is this. Some Christian anti-theodicists say a lot of the theodicies that are made by philosophers, even Christian philosophers, are not sufficiently Christian. They are theodicies that basically describe a generic God, a God of the philosophers. They don't make use of the uniquely Christian doctrines such as the Trinity and the Son of God's incarnation and his crucifixion and his resurrection, things like that. Well, how do we respond to these objections? Are there any truths to these things? Well, I do believe that the practice of making theodicies is a legitimate one. It's not sinful. It's not wrong. It's not totally misguided. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from these criticisms. And I think one thing we should learn is to be humble, right? So I don't think we're going to understand everything about evil by any means. There is some mystery there. Perhaps there is some kind of irrationality to evil that just causes us to come short of any kind of full understanding of it. So one great lesson from these criticisms is that we should be humble, and I think it is the case that we cannot know with any certainty why any particular evil thing has occurred. Now, I do think the Bible gives us some possibilities. We see in the Bible that God, well, yes, he does discipline people with evil. He can bring about judgment, punish people through evil. He can humble people through evil. He can teach people to be more reliant upon him through evil. He uses evil to be to create circumstances in which people do good acts, like helping those who are hurting. It gives opportunity for people to be brave and to fight against evil and to be compassionate and to sacrifice and all these things. There are a lot of different reasons we could think that are like possibilities. God is doing something good with the evil. But we just don't know exactly what. We don't have a God's view on reality, so we don't know all things. I also think that criticism that theodicies are not sufficiently Christian is true of a number of theodicies, and I've read a number of them. I've read many theodicies that are generated by Christian philosophers, and it is true that some of them don't really dig into the Bible, and they don't deal with the issue of Jesus's, his sacrifice on the cross, his resurrection. They don't deal with eschatology, which is the doctrine of the last things. So what happens in the end? I'm not talking about like detailed timelines and charts of end time events and things like that, but just the idea that God is going to make everything right in the end. There's going to be a final reckoning. There's going to be a great judgment, and there's going to be a new creation in which only righteousness and no evil, no death dwells. And yet these very central Christian doctrines, the cross, the eschaton, right, end times, that's often not making its way into some theodicies, which present a kind of generic God, a God of the philosophers. Now, sometimes people say, well, that's a good thing to come up with a simple theodicy, right? That's why they come up with a kind of God of the philosophers approach, because, and this is a little hard to grasp. I don't want to spend a lot of time with it if you're not grasping it. But the idea is that the simpler the story is, the more probable it is to be true, the more likely it is to be true. And this is kind of an Occam's razor thing. Like all things being equal, the simplest explanation is to be favored. And so the simpler explanation has a greater intrinsic probability. The more complicated an explanation gets, the more specific it is, and therefore the less probable it is. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong. Sometimes explanations that are more complex just are the right story. And those stories have greater explanatory power. But they're just not as simple, they're not as probable. Now, I think it's just important to follow truth wherever it leads us. And if the true story of the world is one that is complex, and the one that is specific, and one that deals with specific things like the Trinity, not just a vague notion of God, and what God does to save people, and how he sends his Son into the world, and how his Son dies on the cross and is risen from the grave, and how he'll come again in glory to judge the living and the dead and to make all things new. If that's the story of the world, then if that's the true story, then we want to go with that. So sometimes it's just a kind of a battle of intuitions about what kind of story we should be telling. And that's why I want to defend a Christian story of the world, not a kind of vague, amorphous story of God. And I want to deal with specifically Christian things. And I think the reason why I want to do that is not just because it's important to Christianity, and I believe that's the one true account of God, though I do, but also because the things that are unique to Christianity, like the death and resurrection of Jesus, are actually the things that I think shed the most light on the problem of evil. And so if we are to put those things in the background because, they're more specific, they make the story more complicated, well, I think we're losing something, and I think that would be a mistake. So I do agree with that idea that we should be very biblical with our theodicies, that we should talk about God and creation and providence, or how God governs and guides all things in creation to his intended goal. We should talk about sin. We should talk about salvation and how that is won by Jesus. Here is where I think the criticisms, though, kind of fall flat. The idea that theodicies are impractical or unhelpful is kind of to misunderstand what a theodicy is. So a theodicy is something that is primarily intellectual. It's not merely academic, like we're talking about things that don't matter and things that are just theoretical, but it is an exercise of the mind. It is not something that is intended to fix the world or to eliminate evil or fight against evil. It's not even primarily intended to make people feel better. So what I do is, in my dissertation, I came up with kind of three different tasks. So there's the theodical task, the idea of coming up with a theodicy. That is different from what I call the therapeutic task, which is the idea of making people feel better, or we might say the pastoral task. And it's different also from something we could just call activism, acting against evil. These are three different things. Now, there may be some overlap between these categories, but the important thing to think about is theodicy is not intended to stop evil, to fight evil, to lessen evil, nor is it intended to make people feel better. It is simply an attempt to understand God and the world, and most specifically, that thing in the world we call evil. So I think because that's the case, uh, it is true that if we are to decide between helping someone in a real practical way or trying to rack our brains to come up with a theodicy, help someone in a practical way. When someone is suffering, they don't need an explanation, a theological lecture. What they need is a hug. They need to say, I'm sorry that you're going through this. They need a meal. They need some act of kindness. They need to be reminded that people care, that there's some beauty in the world. And I think if we were to choose between doing things like that and coming up with theodicies, the answer is obvious. If there's an emergency, someone's breaking into your home or someone's trying to harm a loved one, and you have the opportunity to try to stop a person who's doing harm or sit back and come up with a theodicy, obviously you would address the pressing evil that's right in front of you. And so I think, there is something to the criticism that maybe we would be better off channeling more of our efforts to make the world a better place by just practical means. And I think that could be applied to a lot of our life online. I mean, think about how many people spend so much time online, usually in social media, pontificating about all kinds of things in the world. So they see bad things happening. There's this war, there's this fatal shooting involving law enforcement. And everyone has some kind of opinion, and they're spending all this time voicing their opinions and arguing their opinions. Would it be better if we did a lot less of that and stop playing the kind of Monday morning or armchair quarterback or backseat driver or whatever the right metaphor is? If we did a lot less of that and a lot more of just trying to make our world a better place and just starting by the things around us, just being a better family member, a better friend, a better employee, a better citizen, a better neighbor. Yeah, I think we could learn a lot about that. I think that's no contest. If you can choose to spend your precious energy and time in fighting evil and just making the world a better place instead of giving your opinions, that's good. But that doesn't mean there's no place for theodicy. And I don't think everyone's called to be a theodicist. I think a lot of people don't have maybe the intellectual ability or the time, the inclination. They don't have the education. For all different reasons why this is certainly not for everyone. But that by no means says that coming up with theodicies is wrong, it's misguided, it's unhelpful. And I do think that there are times when theodicies can make us feel better. So if you're a Christian and you find a theodicy that gives you some renewed confidence in God, if you have a theodicy that gives you a reason to trust God even though there's evil in the world, and it helps you to place your hope in God, it helps you to persevere through suffering, it shows you some kind of light at the end of a long, dark tunnel that is life, that can make you feel better, and that actually can give you some strength to carry on another day. And so I don't think it's entirely impractical. It's just that theodicies aren't intended to fix evil. Basically, I think what they are is an attempt to understand God. There is this tradition in Christianity of faith-seeking understanding. We believe in God, and we trust in God, and we want to know more about God. And so that's one thing that Anselm had said. There's a quote from Anselm here in this Proslogon. Might even be saying that wrong, but I'm not an Anselm expert. But he said this to God. He says, "I do not try, Lord, to attain your lofty heights, because my understanding is in no way equal to it. but I do desire to understand your truth a little, that truth that my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand so that I may believe, but I believe so that I may understand. Faith seeking understanding. I believe in you, and I just want to understand this faith as much as I can. That's what we're trying to do. And the fact is, I think when evil occurs, we're all going to think something and believe something, and a lot of us will say something. And all of those things are truth claims. And the only way to avoid doing all that is just to try not to formulate any kind of opinion and to say nothing about evil, which is a very hard thing to do. So we may say things like, well, I don't know why God allows evil to occur. That's a very honest thing. And I think that's, for a lot of people, it might be the best option. We can say, I don't know why God allows this particular evil, but Scripture does give us some indication of why in general there's evil in the world, or the possibilities of what God does with particular evils. But people will often say things like, well, God just doesn't want evil to occur. I think that's true in a sense, but it's probably not true in another sense. That we will talk later about God's will and how that can be described in different ways. This was against God's will, right? That's another thing you may hear. Well, I think that's true and false, but in just different ways. What kind of will are we talking about? God didn't want this to happen. This isn't God's will. God had nothing to do with this. That's another big truth claim. I mean, did God had nothing to do with it? Like, there are things that exist that don't have anything to do with God. Well, that's a big claim about God. I think that's a false claim about God. But a lot of the things that people will believe and they will say, they're truth claims, and they're going to be true. They're going to be false. Maybe some combination of truth and falsity. What we're trying to do is understand God and his relationship to the world. That's really what theodicies are about. And that's what I'll be looking at more of as we move forward. I'll be talking about ways to approach theodicies, what I think is at least some methodological considerations. And then I'm going to start looking at different theodicies that people have generated, and analyzing them and seeing the things that are true in them and the things that I think are false in them. And ultimately, this whole exercise is to try to understand God, to have more confidence in him, to, yes, be humble, realizing that we don't know everything. There are secret things that belong to the Lord, as Deuteronomy 29:29 says. But there are also things that God has revealed, and they are for us, according to the same verse. So God has not revealed everything, but he has revealed some things that are important. And we want to apply those things to how we think about evil and how we think about suffering. And that's going to be a lot of what I do in this podcast. But for now, I'll leave us with just that to chew on, and these words that I firmly believe to be true. Jesus is the solution to the problem of evil.